We discovered a body up on the mountain. It was extremely isolated.
This was my first Jane Doe case. It was easily the most brutal attack I've seen on another human.
The physical violence that this woman received, it was personal.
I can't imagine what her last minutes were.
This person could possibly be the last person that saw our victim alive. I need the information that only he possesses. That dot is right where we found the body.
21-year-old Dioneth Lopez recently started a new career at Amazon. But this week, she's taking time off.
Hey, Armando, how's it going?
Dioneth and I, we were very close friends.
How's the new job? Made friends with everyone yet?
She was very friendly, she's very outgoing, a very happy person. We'd all just joke around, watch movies, drink, have a good time.
Armando met Dioneth through his roommate, Sari.
Ella entró a trabajar a ese lugar y nos hicimos más cercanas. Salíamos. Ella nunca te iba a decir un no, ella siempre le ibas a ver con una sonrisa en su cara. Como les digo, que siempre le pedí algo, siempre lo hacía, siempre estaba al pendiente mío, de mi niña. Y es lo que uno más recuerda, su forma de ser.
Dioneth is driven to help provide for her family.
Her main thing was to work, and her biggest goal that I know was to help her mom and then her brother, even if it was working extra hours. So she was very focused on that goal.
Okay. I better head out, okay? Talk to you soon. Bye.
Dioneth plans on flying to Washington State to go hiking.
She was always spontaneously down to do any sort of adventure, She kind of gave me you only live once, so let's go do it. Her positivity, her smile, that vibe she gave, when you approached her, I think that's what made her, her.
Tom 369 Control, can you check in this room, Spring Mountain Southwest, involved eastbound?
Call came in that a body had been found by some salal pickers. So a deputy went out there to check that.
The patrol deputies realized they were probably dealing with a homicide, so then I got a call from patrol asking for the detective unit to come look at the scene.
The scene is very remote. Driving up there, you're driving for miles without even seeing a house. So it's extremely isolated. It's unusual for us to find a body up here. We arrived on scene, and we're trying to get an idea of what the scene is. At this point, we don't know. We get up to the body, and we start looking for what may have been the cause of death.
The victim's hood was covering her head. When I removed the hood and saw all the damage to the skull and her face, when I felt her skull, I could tell she had significant trauma to her skull.
The scene was pretty horrific. Victim's throat's cut, basically from ear to ear.
Because of her state of rigor mortis, I would have assumed she would have only been there for a couple of days.
Do we have any ID?
She had no identification on her. There was no purse. There was no luggage. There was nothing but her and her clothes.
She's in a dark colored jacket, black fur around it.
Her shoes really stuck out. She was wearing pink Guess brand shoes. She had freshly painted fingernails. She had like glitter in her hair. Why is this gal that looks like she's ready to be on a date out in the middle of nowhere?
Detectives look for evidence of how the victim got here.
We're looking for tire marks. We're looking for any evidence that points towards the body moving to the location it was at or from another location. There was some blood splatter on the leaves. On the underside of leaves even. It made us believe that the actual homicide had occurred where she was at.
Investigators comb the area, looking for a murder weapon.
We make our way down the trail. And as we're going down, there's a broken tequila bottle that doesn't look old. That's unusual. We're in the middle of nowhere. This trail doesn't get used much, so that's out of place.
That had obvious blood on it that hadn't been washed off yet.
There was a blue knife there, a tradesman-type knife that had blood on it and it had hair on it. The hair appeared consistent in color with the victim's hair. So at that point, we believed that was likely the knife that was used to cut her throat.
The items are documented and collected for blood and fingerprint analysis.
My 29 years of law enforcement, this was easily the most brutal attack I've seen on another human.
You're talking a young woman who was killed in the prime of her life and left in the middle of nowhere. We have to find out who committed this horrific act.
In this remote location, there are no witnesses or cameras.
The only thing that's close by is a casino and a gas station for miles. That's it. So we thought, well, maybe by the way she's dressed, she could possibly have went to the casino. Or possibly stopped and got gas, or maybe went in the gas station to get a snack. From previous investigations, I know that the casino also runs video surveillance for the gas station. Because that's our best shot at this point.
Police request footage from the casino complex for the past week. Casino security reports seeing a woman matching the victim's description 3 days before the body was found.
Okay, let's see what they said.
We are hoping we actually got video of our victim and that it's going to lead us along the right path to find the suspect and what's happened to this person. So this is a big deal for everybody.
Detectives queue up footage from the gas station where the woman was spotted.
Fast forward. There, is that her? It's not her. Okay, play on. There. Play that again.
We're looking at that video footage, and we're trying to match up as what I saw on scene.
Pause there.
You got a coat, it's lined with fur around the hood. You're looking at the shoes. The shoes stand out. You know, they're bright pink shoes with white soles. Looking at that footage, it was pretty clear that this person was our victim on scene.
Can you switch camera?
Is she waiting for somebody?
She was comfortable. She didn't appear in distress. She was with nobody else.
The victim spent about half an hour within the store. She didn't converse with anybody. She picked something up.
What other angles do we have? Zoom in.
She went and bought this item. What we're looking for when this is happening, we're trying to see really clear, is this person using cash or are they using a card? If they're using a card, we may be able to identify from receipt. And in this case, she did.
Great. Let's request the card details.
What else have we got?
Stop there. Push in on her face.
The main walkway in was the best footage angle that we had. It was a good shot of her face. It's big for us because now we have an investigative lead.
Let's distribute that image, see if anyone can ID her. Can we see where she goes next?
Detectives check the exterior cameras to see if their Jane Doe meets anyone.
Have we got any other cameras? There she is.
It was kind of diagonally across the parking lot, but quite a distance. It was out of the way of regular sight and most of the cameras.
Did she get in the vehicle? Show it again. She's getting in the vehicle behind.
They focus on the front of the second vehicle.
You see her get in the passenger side. Most people don't sit in the passenger side if they're on their own in a vehicle.
It was off in a darker area. You really can't see what's going on there. It's a little frustrating, you know, when you're trying to figure it out and you don't have that right angle.
Do we see the vehicle arriving? Can we rewind? Hold it. Play this forward.
We have the truck pull in. The truck parked. We got some details like of the vehicle. It's a regular cab pickup truck. I know it's either a Chevy or GMC. I know it's a two-wheel drive truck just from looking at it because I used to work at a Chevy dealership. You can't see in this particular angle anybody in it, unfortunately. Got a little more work to do with the investigation to find out who this person actually is.
Detective Waterhouse. Okay. Autopsy's ready.
Okay. Can you keep looking for the vehicle on any other cameras?
The cause of death could have been one of a couple things. It could either be the impact to the head that caused cranial damage to the top. That kind of blunt force trauma could be consistent with this bottle that's out of place, is at the bottom of the trail. We think that's likely what caused the impact on the victim's head. And obviously her throat being cut could have been the other cause of death. The wounds sustained by the victim appeared to be consistent with the blue knife that was found at the top of the trail and was discarded.
I found other injuries, too.
There's forearm injuries. They appear to be defensive wounds. We believe that she put up a fight.
The physical violence that this unfortunate woman received, it was personal.
In Seattle, Deoneth Lopez's friends and family have not heard from her for 4 days.
I get a text from her mom. She's like, hey, my daughter's in Seattle. Do you know anything? And I was kind of like, no, I don't know anything. Maybe her phone died, you know? They didn't take a charger, you know? She'll be back. She went camping. I called her through social media apps, Snapchat, Instagram. I sent her messages and nothing, like, my calls wouldn't go through. I started worrying and I was like, okay, this is weird. So I posted the missing picture with my personal phone number. I shared it on my Facebook. I shared it on Twitter. There was over probably like 500 shares within the Seattle area. But no one knew where she was. At this point, it was like, what's gonna happen? You know, I was scared, basically. We have someone that's missing. It's not normal. Where's the help gonna come from? Like, we need help.
Armando files a missing persons report in hopes of tracking down his friend. In Clallam County, investigators hope to identify the people in the red truck.
So when the vehicle moved out of the parking lot, there's two ways it could have gone. One is to leave the parking lot and be out of camera sight, and that would then be the last that we see of this vehicle. The other is it could have gone through to the gas pumps.
Detectives pull up the camera showing the pumps.
So now we're hoping that the driver goes that way.
That's it.
The truck pulled up at one of the pumps. It's in much clearer light.
Zoom in.
It's a red Chevy Silverado. It looked like the windows were tinted, so you couldn't see into it. There's this tense moment where we're trying to figure out who this is. We're hoping the driver's getting out.
A male got out of the vehicle with what appeared to be the same bag that was carried out from the gas station by the victim, and put that in the trash.
This person could possibly be the last person that saw our victim alive. This is definitely somebody we're interested in talking to. So now the next step is trying to find them.
Punch in.
From this angle, we can't get a good look at his face.
Police focus on the truck. They believe their Jane Doe is inside.
One thing we really wanted to know was there a license plate number?
Push in.
It is a little frustrating when you have footage, you can't see any license plate.
Can we follow the truck? Is there any other angle?
They switch to the exit camera.
Wait. Got you.
Of course, I'm excited, right? So I'm thinking, hey, this is the break that we're looking for, like in the case. We have a license plate that can potentially tell us who this guy is.
Police discover that the plate is registered to a man in the Seattle area. Investigators head to his workplace.
The license plate on the pickup truck came back to an older gentleman.
The man had sold the truck, but the new owner failed to register new plates.
It was actually not the correct plate that should have been on that vehicle. That was very suspicious.
With the previous owner in the clear, detectives search for a better image of the driver. They pull up the parking lot camera before the truck leaves.
We're waiting and hoping that the person driving the truck gets out and goes inside. And we got a good look at his face.
At 5:45 p.m., the driver exits the vehicle.
He starts heading towards the store.
Play that again.
He appeared to walk in quite casually. He's looking around as he walks in. He picks something up.
What does he do next?
So we're hoping at this point that he's going to use a debit or credit card, because that's going to help us identify who this person is by his bank account. Unfortunately, he paid with cash, and that ended up being a dead end.
Have we got him exiting? Stop.
He comes right into camera view, and we get a really good look at him. And the look of this person appears to be a Hispanic male between 25 and 35 years old.
Play that again. Closer.
I, for one, got chills. The hair on the back of my neck stood up because I'm looking at a guy wearing tradesman-type jeans, place where a knife like usually goes on it, and it matches the scene with the trades knives left behind. So this is the point. We know this is likely our suspect. This is our best suspect. It matches the scene.
Detectives receive a copy of the victim's credit card transaction.
You're expecting to see a name.
But the name and account number are not shown.
It's a blow when you see there's no name there. You always reach these dead ends.
Investigators search missing persons databases. Detective Stopani discovers Armando's post about DNF.
The information he had was that the last contact he had was that she was in Seattle on the 10th of February. The video we were looking at was from the 10th of February. We're starting to believe now that this could be our victim.
Detectives head out to see if Armando can make a positive ID.
They show me a picture of her at a gas station. And they asked me, is this her? And I was like, yeah, that's her.
Now we have a name. We have a name for that victim, and that is Diona Lopez.
At this point, I'm like shaking. I'm literally sitting in my couch at home and I'm shaking because I'm like, this cannot be happening. I just started crying. I can't imagine what her last minutes were. It's just, it's sad.
Dioneth's friend, Sarah E., remembers a man she may have been seeing.
Sarai sends me a Facebook profile, and I was like, okay, who's this? And she's like, oh, he might know where she's at.
Lo que me acuerdo, creo que sí, no, terminaban, regresaban, hablaban o no hablaban, pero creo que siempre estuvieron en contacto. Oh, no sé si ella lo buscaba o él la buscaba, pero siempre estuvieron en contacto.
Armando shares the tip with detectives.
She had a secret relationship with a Alex Rojas. Full name is Alejandro Rojas, goes by Alex.
Now we have a name of who we believe could well be our suspect.
So once we identified Alex Rojas, we started looking at this person through social media. It looks like the guy that's in the gas station footage. He's wearing almost identically what he's wearing at the gas station. The exact same hoodie, the exact same pants on social media. Alejandro Rojas appeared to be our prime suspect.
Police learn that as well as dating Deonath, Rojas has a wife and young son. Detectives reach out to Deonath's mother in Mexico.
Having it confirmed, it's been difficult on her mom. It was something that she couldn't believe. She's sad inside, you know?
Deonath's mother also had contact with Rojas. Rojas had told her that he had taken Deonath to the Olympic Parks area to go hiking.
Rojas tells Deonath's mother she planned to meet friends, and he dropped her off by the roadside.
Just outside of the Olympic Parks is the National Forest, and that is where Deonath was found.
They look into Rojas's movements in the days prior to Deonath's body being found.
We have phone numbers for Deonna Lopez and a phone number for Alex Rojas. We're able to get a search warrant for those cell phones and track their movement. She was picked up at SeaTac International Airport by Alex Rojas.
Cell phone data indicates they drive to the gas station, where they stay for 7 hours.
And then going from the gas station and up onto the hill where our crime scene is.
At the scene, their phones are switched off for over 3 hours.
2 cell phones returning back to Seattle, but we know one person didn't. This is not looking good for Rojas.
Detectives decide it's time to interview Rojas. They head out to bring him in.
Mr. Rojas.
We tell him, hey, we're looking at a missing person investigation and we need to talk to you. We're trying to make this person as comfortable as possible, and they're going to be much more comfortable talking about a missing person that they were associated with as opposed to a homicide.
He appeared to have no idea that he was a suspect in this case.
Rojas agrees to come in for an interview.
I need to know what he knows. I have nothing conclusive about the murder of Deonna Lopez.
Basically, we'd like to talk to you just about you picking up and the name. Can you pronounce the first name for me? I'm sure I'm going to mess that up. Deonna? Yeah. So, yeah, you just tell me about that and what's going on, what the plans were.
She came on Monday. I picked her up at 8:30. So we were just driving around the roads and stuff. And we came back to that Chevron that's next to the casino.
Yeah, sure, okay. What truck was it?
It was a Silverado.
Silverado? And is that your rig?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the phone records match. It matched what he tells us. He drove to the gas station where we actually see him on surveillance later in that very vehicle, in that truck.
He said that he spent the night in his truck just a little ways down the street from the gas station.
So what's your relationship with her?
Met her like 2 years ago.
Like 2 years ago?
Yeah, 2 years ago.
How? Okay, so it was like
I met her through a friend, and then we started talking.
Okay.
And we kind of had a thing, but
Okay.
Throughout this entire conversation, he's calm. There's not a lot going on. He's basically matter of fact. But it seemed to me that he knew more than what he was letting on.
To us, looking in, it looks like you guys had a little more of a significant relationship.
yeah.
Can you expand on that a little bit with us?
I mean, we just had a thing, you know.
Where did she want the relationship to go?
Right.
I mean, well, she knew that I was married and stuff.
Right.
Did it cause tension with her or
No.
jealousy at all?
Now he's starting to come forward and spill the beans that he has this woman that he's having a relationship with outside his wife's knowledge. So this is all starting to make more sense.
The next morning, he said he brought her up into the woods and that he dropped her off at the hiking trails.
She was waiting for some friends.
So these friends, did she mention how she knew these people, where they're from, what the plan was? Did she have hiking gear with her?
I mean, she had some boots.
So you dropped her off somewhere without seeing these people?
Yeah.
And she never called you back or anything?
She never called me back, yeah.
Oh, wow.
His answers are vague except for stuff that really isn't going to implicate him.
And how did she seem when she left? I mean, tell me how that went, how you dropped her off. And
I mean, she seemed pretty good.
what did you do after you dropped her off? Did you stop anywhere on the way?
No, I just came back.
Now he's told us a lie that he just dropped her off and left. That's when we confront him with the facts that no, you didn't, because your phone is right here with her phone at the scene.
What we have is phone records. This dot is you. This is your phone.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see that? Hey, go ahead and take it. Yeah, right. So that dot is you.
Mm-hmm.
I have to have him tell me about the crime scene. So I have to put him there because there's no video cameras, no footage from anywhere. Remember, this is remote. No homes, no houses. I have nothing. So I have to have him tell me that he's there.
By that right there, what I handed you, you're off the beaten path. And that dot is right where we found the body. We're going to put this together a little bit, and I can tell you a little bit about what I think, if that's okay. Again, I don't want to scare you to death, but I know you got off the pavement.
He isn't talking a whole lot. So now what I do is I use another tactic, if you will, and I switch gears into putting him in the role of the victim.
It looks like you guys are fighting about something. Got off the pavement, got up there, and I think she was trying to pressure you to leave your wife. That's what I'm thinking.
Started drinking, and, you know, she did tell me a couple of times that she was going to kill my wife and my kid.
What?
Yeah. So,
see, these are facts that we need to know. I mean, really.
I was pretty scared because, you know, you never know what a woman can do, you know, especially like that she would lose her mind out of nowhere.
I need more details from the crime scene that only the person who committed this homicide would know.
She's threatening you to the point where you're having to defend yourself. That's what I want to hear.
She just took out the knife and she just came at me.
Oh my God.
She never got me.
And where's this at?
Right outside the truck.
Right outside the truck?
Yeah.
Like where? Like in the parking lot?
No.
Okay, where?
Where you up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Up in the woods. Okay. So she tried to stab you?
She tried stabbing me. Yeah, and she
did she stab you?
No, she didn't stab me.
Okay, so you have no injuries at all?
You'd think if there was a fight, he would have injuries on him. There wasn't any visible. But we do know that Diona Lopez suffered a blunt trauma injury to the top of her head.
Our whole goal at that point in time is just simply to get him to admit that he hit her with a tequila bottle.
You never actually responded with any force at all. She's got a knife.
Well, just tried like pushing her and stuff like that.
Okay, but there's no. You didn't hit her with anything.
No, I didn't hit her
at all.
Mm-hmm. We just with the bottle. That's it.
Tell us about that.
Well, the bottle was in the passenger seat because she had it. So I just grabbed her and I had it in my hand when she was coming at me, and then that's when I hit her with the bottle.
You hit her with the bottle?
Yeah.
So now he knows that I know that he's the person who committed this homicide.
So once he admitted to the tequila bottle, Detective Waterhouse did reveal their photos.
This is what I'm looking at. Sorry, you gotta look at this. I'll do that. Oh. Yeah.
That's pretty bad.
That is pretty bad, huh?
Yeah.
So, what do you think about that?
Well, I had to defend myself, so it was her or me.
Right.
I got 2 kids.
What do you think about these injuries?
I didn't do those. I don't know how those got there.
Rojas denies attacking Dianeth with the knife found on scene.
It was pretty apparent that was going to be the end of his story, but he'd already admitted to the tequila bottle work, so it wasn't brutally important that he admit to the knife work.
Stand up, turn around, hands behind your back, you're under arrest.
Alejandro Rojas is charged with the second-degree murder of Dianeth Lopez. He pleads guilty, is convicted, and sentenced to 16 years.
At the end of this whole thing, you know, I'm just glad that there was some closure for the family.
Evidence from the crime scene, cell phone data, and security footage help police build a picture of events. Dianeth Lopez flies to Washington to spend time with Rojas, who is hiding their relationship from his wife.
Her whole reason for being there was to discuss her relationship status and that she wanted to spend more time with Mr. Rojas. I don't believe there was ever an intent to go on a hiking trip with friends.
Rojas picks Dianeth up and takes her to the gas station, close to the Olympic National Park.
He parked in a dark area, and they're never together. They're in and out of the gas station at different times. It could be he doesn't want to be seen with her.
The couple spend the night in the truck by the side of the road. The next morning, Rojas drives Dianeth into the forest.
I believe he took her up to the woods as a ruse of somewhere private to go. Possibly drunk too much based on the alcohol bottle that was used. And they got into this physical confrontation.
Rojas strikes a devastating blow with the bottle, and Dianeth is savagely attacked with the knife.
Fui al lugar de los hechos. Fuimos un grupo de amigos a ponerle velas, una cruz. Empezamos a compartir momentos felices que cada uno había vivido con ella.
The golden California sun of 1982 did not bring warmth to the rugged coastline of Ventura County. Instead, it cast long, sinister shadows across a community that was about to lose its innocence in the span of a single, terrifying night. It was an unseasonably cold November evening when the coastal fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, masking the movements of an absolute monster who was hunting for prey along the quiet residential avenues. A 21-year-old college student, A bright young woman who spent her weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter and dreamed of becoming a marine biologist, vanished from her off-campus apartment without leaving a single trace of her departure. Her roommate returned from a late-night study session at the university library to find the front door slightly ajar, a chilling draft whistling through the narrow hallway, and a freshly baked tray of cookies still sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. The television was still hummed with static, broadcasting a blank screen into the empty living room, while the victim's car keys and purse remained untouched on the coffee table, a terrifying indication that she had been torn away from her sanctuary in a matter of seconds. The immediate response from the local police department was a chaotic frenzy of flashing red and blue lights that pierced through the dense, heavy fog, but as the hours quickly bled into agonizing days, a crushing realization settled over the coastal town that they were dealing with a calculated, elusive predator who had slipped into the night like a ghost. This was the dark genesis of an absolute cold case, a sudden and violent mystery that would baffle generations of investigators and hang over the community like a toxic shroud for over 40 years, a living nightmare that began when a young life was violently erased from the fabric of reality. The crime scene itself offered nothing but a masterclass in forensic frustration, a clinical void that left even the most seasoned homicide detectives staring at the walls in utter disbelief and helpless anger. There were no signs of forced entry on the deadbolts, no shattered glass glinted on the carpet, and no blood-stained struggles marred the neat arrangement of her furniture. The entire apartment possessed a haunting, sterile cleanliness that suggested the attacker possessed an intimate knowledge of police processing techniques. A comprehensive grid search of the surrounding coastal cliffs and sandy dunes yielded only fragmented, frustrating dead ends, a single set of tire tracks on a dirt turnout that the encroaching Pacific tide had already partially washed away, a discarded woolen glove near the highway that was too degraded for latent print development, and a series of contradictory statements from neighbors who claimed to have heard a low, rumbling engine at 3 a.m. but couldn't agree on the color or make of the vehicle. The community instantly retreated behind newly installed deadbolts and iron security screen doors, their eyes filled with a defensive, paranoid suspicion as they watched true crime reporters descend upon their quiet coastal enclave, turning their private terror into a sensationalized headline that screamed of a phantom serial killer lurking in the California surf. This was a mystery sealed tight from its very inception, a cold case born from the total absence of structural evidence and the paralyzing fear that locked the jaws of anyone who might have seen a shadow moving through the midnight fog. As the weeks froze into a bitter coastal winter, the initial surge of tips dried up entirely, the investigative task force was quietly disbanded, and the thick cardboard file was relegated to a dusty basement shelf in the county archives, its contents destined to warp under the relentless coastal humidity while the perpetrator walked the earth completely free. The early days of the investigation were defined by a manual, grueling grind that relied on primitive methodologies that were utterly incapable of piercing the veil of anonymity that the killer had wrapped around his crime. Detectives spent months typing up index cards, cross-referencing handwritten logs of known sex offenders, transient construction workers, and out-of-town hitchhikers who had been logged passing through the state route on the night of the abduction. They conducted hundreds of high-pressure interviews, pushing suspect after suspect until their alibis were worn thin, yet every promising lead eventually disintegrated into a dead end, leaving the department with nothing but a collection of shattered theories and broken promises. There was a persistent, whispering theory within the bullpen that the predator was not a drifter passing through from Los Angeles or San Francisco, but a local resident who knew the specific patrol schedules of the deputies, someone who understood exactly which stretches of the coastline were entirely unmonitored by security cameras or civilian eyes. But in an era where DNA profiling was a distant, theoretical concept in a university research lab, suspicion without physical evidence was a useless weapon, and the file slowly became a monument to professional failure, a cold case that mocked the badge and the uniform every single day it remained unsolved. The victim's family was left to navigate a desert of silent grief, their lives permanently fractured by the unknown, forced to live in a town where the monster who had stolen their daughter was likely buying groceries at the same supermarket or sitting next to them at a local diner. As the decades began to blend into one another with a slow, agonizing passage of time, the 1982 case transitioned from an active investigation into a piece of dark local folklore, a cautionary tale that parents used to keep their teenage daughters from walking along the isolated beach cliffs after sunset. The original detectives who had stood in that fog-slicked apartment retired one by one, handing over their notes to a new generation of investigators who looked at the yellowing pages with a sense of historical detachment, viewing the crime as a relic of a bygone era that could never be resolved. The landscape of Ventura County underwent a dramatic, multi-billion-dollar transformation. The quiet coastal fields were paved over with luxury beachfront estates. Modern shopping plazas rose where the dirt turnouts had once been, and the generation that remembered the visceral terror of 1982 began to fade into the local cemeteries, taking their personal suspicions into the earth with them. Yet, the perpetrator remained a living, breathing entity within the grand design of the state, a cold-blooded architect of destruction who had successfully mastered the art of complete social assimilation, watching the world transition into the internet age while remaining entirely invisible to the radar of modern law enforcement. It was a terrifying masterpiece of evasion, a silent pact between a predator and the calendar that suggested some horrors are simply too clean for human justice to correct, leaving the concept of ultimate accountability looking like a hollow fairy tale told to comfort the brokenhearted. Then, the relentless, exponential march of forensic technology reached a sudden, historic tipping point, a silent scientific revolution that didn't care about the passage of 40 years or the fact that the physical evidence had been locked in a dark basement since the reign of Ronald Reagan. A specialized state cold case unit, armed with modern grants and high-tech investigative tools, pulled the 1982 file from its resting place, not because they had received a sudden deathbed confession or a rogue tip from an old informant, but because the genetic blueprint of human life could now be deciphered from a single, microscopic trace of biological material. Technicians utilized an advanced, vacuum-assisted DNA collection system on the victim's preserved clothing, pulling a pristine, untouched profile of the killer from the ancient fabric, a profile that had sat in the dark for decades, waiting for science to catch up to its malice. This profile was not uploaded into the traditional, limited law enforcement databases which relied on direct criminal matches. Instead, it was injected into the cutting-edge realm of investigative genetic genealogy, a high-tech methodology that searches through vast, public family tree registries to track a suspect through the biological profiles of his distant relatives, his ancestors, and his cousins. The laboratory became a digital cathedral of historical reconstruction, where the blurry, 40-year-old shadow of a coastal monster began to resolve into a sharp, undeniable family lineage that was deeply rooted in the history of the state itself. The high-tech breakthrough did not manifest as a sudden, dramatic siren wail in the middle of the night. It arrived as a quiet, mathematical certainty that flashed onto a high-definition computer monitor in a sterile laboratory, an analytical match that sent a collective shockwave through the upper echelons of California law enforcement. The algorithm had bypassed 4 decades of human deception, political shifts, and geographic movements by simply tracing the immutable genetic markers of the suspect's third cousins, mapping a direct line through a massive family tree that ultimately terminated at a single, living individual. The name that emerged from the digital darkness was an absolute bombshell for the investigators. It was not a hardened career criminal living in a concrete cell, nor a transient drifter hiding in the margins of society, but a highly respected, affluent retired businessman who lived in a multi-million-dollar home overlooking the very coastline where the victim had been abducted. The predator had spent 40 years building a fortress of absolute respectability, operating a successful local real estate firm, donating heavily to civic charities, and playing golf with judges and politicians, using his immense wealth and unblemished reputation to insulate himself from the horror of his youth. The detectives stared at the modern photograph of the white-haired grandfather, their chests tightening as they realized that the monster who had eluded them for a generation had been living as a pillar of the community, smiling at their parades and walking the very same beaches where he had hunted his prey in 1982. The The planning for the final tactical arrest had to be executed with the surgical secrecy of a counterterrorism operation because a single leak to the local media or a rogue communication within the affluent coastal neighborhood would allow the suspect to use his massive financial resources to charter a private plane or destroy the remaining historical remnants of his personal life. A specialized team of state marshals and outside forensic investigators assembled in the pre-dawn darkness of a foggy Tuesday, their black SUVs moving without headlights through the gated community where the retired businessman resided in absolute luxury. There was no high-speed pursuit through the canyon roads, no cinematic shootout on the manicured lawns. There was only the heavy, rhythmic thud of a tactical entry team breaching a solid oak door, followed by the authoritative command of the law echoing through the vaulted ceilings of the mansion. When the marshals pushed into the master bedroom, the man who stood there was not a terrifying beast from a horror film. He was an aging elite in an expensive silk robe, his aristocratic face momentarily freezing into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror before the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrinkled wrists, permanently ending his 44-year run of total anonymity. The community woke up to the staggering sight of forensic vans blocking the driveway of their prominent neighbor and the image of a local millionaire being led down his steps in restraints, his head bowed against the coastal breeze, a sight that shook the foundations of the county far harder than the original tragedy had decades prior. Inside the sterile, windowless environment of the state interrogation facility, the social currency and political influence that the billionaire had relied upon for his entire adult life evaporated into the cold hum of the air conditioning, leaving him looking small, withered, and intensely vulnerable beneath the glare of the recording lights. The veteran state interrogators didn't offer him the deference he was accustomed to at the country club board meetings. They simply laid out the genealogical charts, the high-tech forensic printouts, and the 1982 crime scene photographs, creating an unassailable wall of digital evidence that blocked every potential avenue of legal deception. He tried to use his professional voice at first, blustering about his corporate contributions to the state's infrastructure, threatening the careers of the investigators across the table, and painting himself as the victim of a high-tech identity theft conspiracy designed to seize his estate. But as the hours dragged into the grueling afternoon and the prosecutors methodically demonstrated that his private sailboat had been logged at the local marina on the exact night of the abduction, his posture completely collapsed, the sharp, authoritative gaze of the businessman dissolving into the panicked, darting eyes of a cornered animal who realized his own biology had betrayed him across 40 years of time. The ripple effect of the high-tech arrest tore through Ventura County like a structural wildfire, transforming every civic institution into a zone of deep suspicion and turning lifelong friends into paranoid strangers who wondered how deep the deception had truly run throughout their social circles. The local real estate board was instantly thrown into a state of total paralysis, with state auditors seizing digital servers, filing cabinets, and historical land transactions from the official's former corporate offices to determine if he had used his financial dominance over the decades to buy the silence of local figures or alter county records relating to his past movements. The exclusive country club, once a place of mundane gossip about golf handicaps and market trends, became an arena of intense forensic autopsy, with members suddenly remembering strange, volatile flashes of temper the businessman had displayed over the years, his intense aversion to any conversation involving unsolved crimes, and the way he had always championed private security firms over public police budgets. The shock was accompanied by a profound sense of existential betrayal that extended to the local university board where he served as a trustee, the children's charities he financed, and the multi-generational families who had bought their homes through his agency, forcing an entire population to realize that their coastal paradise had been financed by the bloody legacy of an unpunished predator. The legal proceedings were a masterclass in institutional prosecution, as the state sought to ensure that the defendant's immense wealth could not purchase a technical loophole in the wheels of justice, while his high-priced defense team launched a multi-million-dollar campaign to invalidate the genetic genealogy methodology itself. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of raw, volatile emotion every single day, packed to absolute capacity with the victim's surviving relatives, current real estate executives who had served under the defendant, and ordinary citizens who needed to see the illusion of his elite invincibility finally shattered by a modern jury. The prosecution presented their case with a devastating, unemotional precision, weaving the primitive circumstantial clues of 1982 together with the absolute, unassailable certainty of modern genetic profiling until the defense's arguments about contaminated samples felt like desperate whispers against a thunderstorm. When the retired billionaire was forced to stand to receive the verdict, his expensive tailored suit could not hide the violent trembling of his frame as the word, guilty, echoed through the vaulted chambers, a sound that carried the weight of 44 years of accumulated sorrow and uncollected debt, followed immediately by a sentence of life, without the slightest possibility of parole. The sirens have long since faded from the scenic coastal highways of Ventura County, and the national news trucks have packed up their satellite dishes to find newer, fresher horrors in other zip codes. But the silence that has settled over the community is not the peaceful quiet of a mystery solved. It is the hollow, haunted stillness of a valley that has discovered its foundations were built on a graveyard. The 1982 cold case is technically closed, the electronic ledger in the courthouse database marked with a red stamp of total completion, but the psychological scars left by the predator's double life have become a permanent, structural element of the coastal landscape. You can see it in the way the current city council speaks in hushed, guarded tones, the way the local police officers look down when the history of the department is mentioned, and the way the elderly residents still stare out at the Pacific horizon when the autumn fog begins to roll into the canyons. The high-tech resolution did not bring back the young woman who was erased from the world on that cold November night, nor did it undo the decades of silent terror that reshaped the character of an entire generation. It merely proved that justice is a patient, terrifying hunter that doesn't care about a killer's wealth, his social status, or the number of years he managed to hide behind a public smile. The cold finality of that maximum security sentence did not dissolve into the salty ocean air of Ventura County. Instead, it transformed into an oppressive, historical weight that forced the entire state of California to look back at the decades where an apex predator had dictated the terms of his own absolute immunity. The plastic evidence bins and digitized microfilms that had sat in the climate-controlled vaults of the sheriff's department for over 40 years were no longer dead storage. They were now a glaring monument to a systemic blindness that had allowed a local real estate mogul to write the narrative of his own survival. Detectives who had inherited the 1982 case file in the mid-90s, only to pass it along to the next generation with a shrug of defeated resignation, were suddenly called back from their retirements, forced to answer for the gaping holes in the initial canvas, the tips that were mysteriously dropped, and the subtle, unspoken social deference that had kept the eyes of law enforcement fixed firmly on the transient drifters while the true monster was purchasing the very land beneath their precinct. It became instantly clear that the total lack of forced entry in that off-campus apartment was not a stroke of criminal luck, but the calculated work of a man who belonged to the city's elite, an insider who could walk up a front porch in broad daylight without raising a single alarm because his face was synonymous with local prosperity and trust. The state's post-conviction task force quickly expanded its focus beyond the specific parameters of that cold November night, launching a comprehensive, digital audit of the billionaire's entire financial and personal history during the early 1980s. Investigators began digging through ancient corporate tax records, structural blueprints of his early construction projects, and the private slip logs of the local yacht clubs where his luxury vessels had been docked. What they uncovered was a terrifying pattern of geographic and temporal manipulation. A man who had systematically used his rising position in the Southern California real estate market to acquire isolated pockets of coastal land just prior to major spikes in regional predator activity. The documents revealed that every time a suspicious prowler report or an unresolved assault occurred along the Pacific Coast Highway, the official's corporate entities had purchased the adjacent properties through a complex network of shell corporations, immediately erecting high-security fences and designating the territory as private development zones. This wasn't a businessman expanding his portfolio. It was an apex predator engineering his own private hunting corridors, altering the physical geography of the county to ensure that his late-night movements would remain shielded from the sight of passing police cruisers and neighborhood watches. As the state troopers continued to peel back the layers of his corporate empire, they began tracking down the surviving members of the 1982 campus security force and local midnight patrol deputies, conducting high-pressure interviews in the quiet, sun-baked suburbs of Arizona and Nevada, where many of the old-timers had retired. Under the clinical glare of modern recorded interviews, a deeply unsettling narrative of administrative sterilization began to take shape, a story of missing logbook entries, delayed response times, and casual suggestions from prominent city developers that digging too deeply into the off-campus student neighborhoods could damage the university's enrollment and tank the surrounding property values. One retired sergeant recalled a specific afternoon in December of 1982 when the suspect, then a charismatic young broker, had dropped by the station to deliver a massive donation to the Police Athletic League, casually asking the captain over cigars if the laboratory had found anything useful on the victim's clothing, his tone perfectly mimicking that of a concerned civic champion while his eyes remained cold and static as ice. The sergeant remembered a brief, passing flash of revulsion at the man's unnatural intensity, but the feeling was instantly buried beneath the weight of the broker's immense social capital and his tight connections to the county board of supervisors. The community's descent into a state of permanent paranoia accelerated as these discovery documents were systematically logged into the public court database, turning every beachside cafe and surf shop along the coast into an arena of intense forensic analysis and historical self-reproach. People who had worked in the suspect's real estate offices during the boom years of the 1980s began to review their old interactions through a completely inverted lens, realizing that his famous, unpredictable flashes of volatile temper, his absolute obsession with the security codes of his luxury listings, and his habit of taking his private boat out into the ocean during heavy coastal storms were not the eccentricities of a high-powered executive, but the dark release valves of an unpunished monster. The local civic center, where his real estate firm had funded a massive public pavilion bearing his family name, became a symbol of a grand structural illusion. The bronze plaque commemorating his philanthropy felt like a grotesque joke carved into the stone, a physical reminder of how easily a predator can purchase the adoration and the silence of the very public he was actively terrorizing. The psychological trauma inflicted upon the town's oldest residents was profound. They were forced to acknowledge that the clean, wealthy, safe paradise they thought they had built was actually financed and shaped by the bloody legacy of a man who had stolen a young woman's future. While the county wrestled with its internal demons, the high-tech forensic genealogy laboratory in Northern California continued its relentless, automated work, treating the billionaire's genetic profile as a master key that could potentially unlock dozens of other unresolved coastal mysteries from the late 20th century. Scientists utilized advanced, high-density single nucleotide polymorphism sequencing to compare the suspect's DNA against the microscopic traces recovered from old, unsolved cold cases across the entire western seaboard, searching for any indication of a wider pattern of serial predation. Every run of the laboratory's genetic sequencers was an absolute battle against time and the natural degradation of biological material that had been stored in suboptimal conditions for over 4 decades. The technicians moved through the ancient evidence bags with a hushed, military precision, understanding that their data was the only force capable of destroying the multi-million-dollar legal defense team that the suspect's estate had assembled to drag the case into an endless maze of appeals and technicalities. The defense strategy, heavily financed by the suspect's remaining corporate assets, began to flood the legal media with aggressive challenges to the state's investigative methodology, attempting to paint the use of public genealogy databases as an unconstitutional, dystopian surveillance dragnet that turned every citizen's medical data into a police weapon. They hired their own elite geneticists and privacy lawyers from Washington, D.C. and Boston, men who held slick press conferences using highly technical language to suggest that the DNA sample recovered from the 1982 fabric had been hopelessly cross-contaminated by decades of improper storage in a damp police locker, rendering the high-tech match completely invalid. This was a calculated, expensive gaslighting campaign designed to plant a seed of existential doubt in the collective mind of the state's legal system, turning a straightforward trial about a violent murder into an abstract, terrifying debate about digital overreach, corporate data leaks, and the total erosion of personal privacy in the 21st century. The suspect himself remained completely stoic within the reinforced walls of his high-security cell, refusing to speak to the state's behavioral analysts, his demeanor transitioning from the initial, explosive outrage of a fallen titan to the cold, calculated silence of a sociopath who believed his money would eventually buy him a way out of the abyss. The social friction in the county reached a boiling point during the week of the post-conviction discovery hearings, an event that drew international true crime networks, legal analysts, and documentary filmmakers to the Ventura County Courthouse, turning the historic plaza into a chaotic jungle of camera cranes, satellite trucks, and shouting reporters. Local residents had to navigate a daily gauntlet of global media attention just to conduct their routine business, their private history and structural shame broadcast to millions of screens around the world as an example of the banality of evil in wealthy suburban enclaves. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The suspect sat between his high-priced attorneys, his white hair perfectly combed, his face an unreadable mask of aristocratic disdain, his eyes fixed firmly on the judge as if he could command a dismissal through the sheer force of his financial legacy. When the prosecution presented a new series of digital overlays showing that the suspect's early real estate cell phone, one of the primitive, heavy models from the mid-'80s, had consistently pinged towers adjacent to 3 other unresolved missing person cases along the coast, a dead silence fell over the gallery. A cold shock that made the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs outside feel incredibly loud. The state's presentation was not merely an explanation of scientific data, it was a total execution of a manufactured legacy, a systematic, hour-by-hour destruction of the pristine public image that the suspect had maintained since 1982. They introduced a series of historical maritime logs from the Coast Guard showing that on the night of the abduction, his private yacht had signed out of the harbor under a false registration number, moving into the dark coastal waters without its running lights active, effectively vanishing from the radar of the local harbor patrol during the exact 3-hour window of the crime. They produced ancient personal banking records showing a sudden, unpublicized transfer of large sums of cash to a private bank account in the Cayman Islands just 48 hours after the search for the victim was officially launched by the sheriff's office. The accumulation of these minute, historical details, when illuminated by the undeniable accuracy of the high-tech genetic match, transformed his entire 40-year career into a grotesque piece of performance art, a multi-million-dollar theater piece designed to keep the world from looking at the blood on his hands. The emotional peak of these hearings arrived when the victim's former roommate, now a woman in her early 60s with lines of sorrow etched deep around her eyes, took the stand to describe the lifelong psychological sentence that the suspect's evasion of justice had imposed on her life. She spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity that stripped the room of its legal and technical abstractions, describing a life spent in a state of continuous, hypervigilant terror, a 40-year nightmare where she checked the deadbolts on her doors 4 times every single night, unable to shake the memory of that open front door and the smell of coastal fog that had filled her apartment in 1982. The revelation that the predator who had caused this lifelong devastation had been living less than 5 miles away in an oceanfront mansion, attending the same charity galas and dining at the same high-end restaurants as her family, sent a visceral shudder through the courtroom, causing even the hardened court marshals to look down at the floor in a moment of shared, heavy silence. As the judge retired to her chambers to review the new evidence and determine the scope of the state's ongoing investigation into the suspect's potential secondary crimes, the town outside seemed to hang in a state of fragile, explosive suspension, the normal machinery of coastal commerce grinding to a halt beneath the weight of the impending decision. The local police department, which had been under a cloud of intense public scrutiny since the high-tech arrest exposed the failures of their historical predecessors, stationed extra units around the suspect's real estate headquarters and his vacant beachfront properties, fearing that the raw, volatile anger brewing in the neighborhoods could erupt into vigilante action or public destruction. The case had transitioned from a standard criminal prosecution into an existential reckoning for the entire region, a definitive test of whether the modern legal system possessed the strength to hold a man of limitless wealth and immense social power accountable for a horror committed in an era when the rules of evidence were entirely different. The deep, heavy silence that occupied the coastal streets during those hours of waiting was the silence of a structural wound that could never be healed by a legal document, a cold realization that regardless of the final ruling, the idyllic California paradise they thought they inhabited had been built over a dark, unresolved cavern of absolute malice. The subsequent refusal of the appellate courts to grant the suspect a temporary release on bail, despite a massive financial bond offered by his remaining real estate entities, signaled the true collapse of the billionaire's multi-million-dollar defense strategy, plunging his legal team into a state of chaotic internal recrimination. The high-priced attorneys from Washington, D.C., who had confidently promised to dismantle the state's genetic genealogy methodology on constitutional grounds, were forced to watch as the historical geography of their client's rise to power was methodically mapped by state investigators using modern digital tracking matrices. The state's technical team did not rely on the fading, subjective memories of the few surviving 1982 witnesses. They assembled a clinical, digital recreation of the Ventura County coastline as it existed 44 years prior, utilizing ancient geological surveys and aerial reconnaissance photos to prove that the suspect's early construction sites perfectly mirrored the geographic path of the predator's movements. This virtual blueprint left no room for legal theater or smooth rhetoric. It demonstrated with mathematical precision that the broker had systematically used his early access to vacant, half-built luxury listings to orchestrate his late-night hunts, using his professional keys and security clearances to turn the expanding coastal suburbs into his private, unmonitored stalking grounds. The structural weight of these expanding disclosures initiated a secondary, deeply destructive wave of paranoia across the affluent residential enclaves that line the coastal cliffs, forcing the region's elite to examine their own multi-generational social circles with a sharp, defensive terror. At the local yacht clubs and charity boards where the white-haired billionaire had once commanded absolute deference, his name was suddenly purged from the official archives with a frantic, bureaucratic panic, his former associates scrambling to distance their corporate entities from the radioactive fallout of his exposure. Men who had sailed to the Channel Islands with him on his luxury vessels during the late 1980s began to look back at those weekend excursions with a sudden, sickening clarity, recalling his obsessive insistence on steering the boat away from standard Coast Guard patrol corridors, his complete lack of empathy during casual conversations about regional crimes, and his rigid, volatile reaction whenever anyone looked too closely at the secure, locked storage compartments beneath the main deck. The luxury yacht, which had once been a premier symbol of high society networking and coastal prestige, was now towed to a secure state storage facility in San Pedro, its hull being systematically dismantled by forensic teams using advanced chemical imaging sprays to search for the invisible, biological phantoms of past violence that time could not completely erase. The community's sense of security was further decimated when the state prosecution filed a massive asset forfeiture lien against the billionaire's primary real estate firm, a legal maneuver that effectively froze hundreds of commercial land transfers and residential developments across Southern California, triggering an immediate, structural recession within the local economy. Construction sites that had been scheduled to bring thousands of luxury residential units to the cliffs of Ventura County were suddenly abandoned overnight, the heavy bulldozers left to rust against the backdrop of the Pacific Ocean like mechanical skeletons marking the sudden execution of a corporate empire. Small business owners and local contractors who had signed multi-year development agreements with the suspect's agency found themselves facing sudden, absolute financial ruin, their life savings trapped in a sprawling legal void created by their proximity to the killer's money laundering matrix. The town was learning through the brutal realities of canceled bank lines and frozen equity accounts that their decades of coastal prosperity had been directly subsidized by the silence of a monster, that the multi-million-dollar real estate boom that transformed the county in the late 20th century was merely a glittering, corporate shield built to buy the absolute blindness of the public. While the corporate landscape imploded, the forensic technicians inside the state's high-tech laboratory continued their relentless, Automated excavation of the biological evidence recovered during the pre-dawn raid on the billionaire's oceanfront mansion, operating with the hushed, military precision of scientists handling high-yield explosives. They utilized advanced, secondary mass spectrometry to analyze the chemical composition of items that had been hidden in the secret basement vault, discovering that the suspect had maintained an extensive, private collection of vintage newspaper clippings, original police dispatch printouts, and microfiche copies of university student profiles dating back to the winter of 1982. This hidden archive was a terrifying testament to his psychological structure, a proof that his 40-year public career as a civic philanthropist was an entirely artificial performance, a superficial layer of normalcy curated to distract the world, while his true identity remained locked in the dark with the memories of his victims. The technicians were working to match the microscopic touch DNA signatures found on these preserved documents with unresolved missing person profiles from across the entire western seaboard, transforming the real estate mogul's private collection into a comprehensive, automated map of serial predation that threatened to rewrite the true crime history of the entire state. The defense team, recognizing that the clinical accuracy of the genetic genealogy match had rendered their traditional arguments about cross-contamination completely obsolete, shifted their public relations campaign to a desperate assault on the mental competency of their own client, suggesting that the 84-year-old billionaire was suffering from advanced cognitive decline that made it impossible for him to assist in his own defense. They released a series of highly publicized medical assessments from private neurological consultants from Beverly Hills, claiming that the suspect's stoic, catatonic silence in his maximum security cell was not the behavior of a cold-blooded sociopath, but the symptom of a rapid, age-related dementia that had erased his memory of the 1980s entirely. This was a classic, high-stakes legal maneuver designed to keep the suspect from ever having to face a public jury in a full capital murder trial, an expensive attempt to bypass the demands of historical accountability by wrapping the killer in the protective, medicalized armor of an unpunished infirmity. The state prosecution responded instantly by filing a motion for an independent evaluation by a panel of state-appointed forensic psychiatrists, setting the stage for an intense, highly volatile mental competency hearing that would turn the vaulted halls of the courthouse into an arena of deep psychological warfare. The social friction inside the county reached an absolute peak during the week of these psychiatric hearings as international news crews and digital media platforms returned to the Ventura County Plaza, erecting a dense forest of cameras, satellite dishes, and high-intensity lights that bathed the historic facade in a continuous, surreal glow. The local residents were forced to live under a state of permanent media siege, their morning commutes disrupted by flashing police blockades and their private neighborhood forums flooded with wild speculations about the billionaire's hidden mental state. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The suspect sat motionless between his lawyers, his skin appearing pale and bloodless under the harsh fluorescent lights, his gaze fixed on the mahogany table as if he were entirely detached from the proceedings around him. When the lead state psychiatrist took the stand, his voice carrying the calm, clinical authority of an expert who spent decades interviewing the country's most deceptive predators, he systematically dismantled the defense's narrative of cognitive decline, demonstrating through a review of the suspect's recent recorded jail phone calls that his silence was a highly calculated, deliberate strategy of non-cooperation designed to control the flow of information. The psychiatrist's testimony was not just an evaluation of mental fitness. It was a devastating autopsy of a sociopathic intelligence, a step-by-step description of how the real estate mogul had used his immense wealth and professional dominance to manage his internal malice with the same administrative precision he used to run his corporate empire. The expert revealed that during his closed-door interviews with the suspect, whenever the 1982 coastal fog or the specific off-campus student apartment was mentioned, the billionaire's pulse rate and skin conductivity, measured by hidden biometric monitors, showed a sudden, explosive spike of acute psychological awareness that completely contradicted his outward expression of blank, senile indifference. The killer was not forgetting his crime. He was actively, intensely remembering it, his brain functioning with the hyper-vigilant clarity of a hunter who understood that the state was currently tracing the exact trajectory of his historical sins. The revelation that the white-haired grandfather was performing a masterfully crafted act of dementia to protect his multi-million-dollar estate from the scales of justice sent a wave of visceral fury through the crowded gallery, hardening the expressions of the victim's surviving relatives who sat in the front row, their eyes locked on the back of the defendant's head. The emotional climax of the hearings arrived on a Thursday afternoon when the prosecution introduced a series of audio logs that had been captured by the prison's internal communication network just 3 days after the pre-dawn raid, recordings of a whispered conversation between the billionaire and his primary corporate executor during a mandatory legal visit. In the recording, the suspect's voice was entirely devoid of the frail, trembling quality his defense lawyers had displayed to the press. It was sharp, arrogant, and filled with a cold, calculating authority as he ordered his associate to immediately liquidate 3 specific beachfront property trusts in Malibu and transfer the funds to an offshore corporate account in Switzerland before the state could finalize its asset forfeiture liens. The audio was an absolute bomb dropped into the center of the courtroom, an undeniable proof of absolute mental clarity and active criminal coordination that shattered the illusion of cognitive decline beyond any hope of legal resurrection. The judge did not hesitate. She stood from her bench and delivered an immediate, blistering oral ruling that found the defendant completely competent to stand trial, ordering that the selection of a capital jury begin immediately without any further delay or technical postponement. As the courthouse doors swung open that evening, releasing the packed crowd into the cool, damp coastal air, the town outside seemed to absorb the ruling with a collective, heavy stillness, the realization settling into the bones of the community that there would be no clean, clinical escape from the horror of their history, that their most prominent citizen was going to be forced to stand before a jury of his peers and answer for the blood on his hands. The local police department, facing an intense wave of public scrutiny as the media continued to exhume the investigative failures of the 1982 precinct, stationed extra tactical units around the courthouse perimeter, fearing that the volatile mixture of multi-generational grief and corporate betrayal could boil over into public unrest before the first juror could be sworn in. The case had long since ceased to be a standard criminal prosecution. It had become an existential trial for the character of California's coastal heartland, a question of whether the unassailable power of modern forensic science could successfully break through the ultimate fortress of elite privilege and corporate wealth to deliver a long-overdue debt to a young woman who had been erased from the world 44 years prior. The selection of the final 12 jurors was an exercise in pure institutional endurance, requiring the court to process over 1,000 potential candidates during a month of intense, deeply personal questioning that forced ordinary citizens to confront their deepest feelings about wealth, power, and the reliability of modern technology. Data analysts from both sides spent hours auditing the digital histories, social media profiles, and family lineages of every person who entered the box, looking for any hidden connection to the suspect's real estate network or the historical trauma of the 1982 disappearance. The final panel was a diverse cross-section of the coastal valley: teachers, mechanics, tech workers, and small farmers, people who carried the traditional values of the region, but who were now tasked with judging the absolute betrayal of those very ideals by one of their own community leaders. As the date for the formal opening statements approached, the atmosphere on Main Street grew increasingly charged, a silent, demanding hunger for a resolution that could finally clear the air of the toxic secrets that had poisoned their coastal paradise for over 4 decades. When the lead state prosecutor finally stood to address the jury on an unseasonably cold Monday morning, the room fell into a silence so absolute that the sound of the Pacific surf crashing against the distant cliffs could be felt through the historic floorboards of the building. He didn't begin his presentation with complex charts or genetic algorithms. He began by placing a large, framed photograph of the victim from 1982 on a wooden easel directly in front of the defense table, forcing the white-haired billionaire to look into the eyes of the 21-year-old college student whose future he had stolen in the coastal fog 44 years prior. The prosecutor's voice was low, measured, and entirely devoid of political theatricality as he promised the jury that the state would use the unassailable, high-tech tools of the 21st century to strip away the suspect's manufactured legacy, tracing a straight, unbroken line of scientific truth from that dark November night directly to the hands of the wealthy businessman sitting across from them. The trial of the century was finally underway, and as the first forensic exhibits were projected onto the screen, the town realized that the ghost of 1982 had finally broken out of its cardboard tomb, dragging its killer behind it into the blinding, unforgiving light of absolute justice. The projection of the three-dimensional laser scans of the victim's apartment marked the precise moment the trial shifted from an academic debate on genetics to a visceral resurrection of the night the coastal fog became a shroud for an absolute horror. The high-definition renderings filled the massive digital screen behind the witness stand, casting a cold, architectural glow over the wood-paneled courtroom, illuminating every corner of the off-campus sanctuary exactly as it had existed before the intrusion of the predator in 1982. The modern jury sat in transfixed, horrified silence as the prosecution's technical expert used a digital tracker to navigate the virtual space, tracing the line of sight from the undisturbed kitchen counter, where the tray of cookies had sat cooling for 44 years, directly to the front entryway doorframe where the killer's microscopic biological signature had been recovered. The visual precision of the data effectively bridged the immense temporal chasm between the past and the present, rendering the defense team's earlier arguments about historical document degradation entirely irrelevant against the absolute, immutable geometry of the crime scene. The defense team, visibly shaken by the clinical impact of the digital recreation, attempted to regain their footing by launching an aggressive cross-examination of the crime scene technician, scrambling to inject a narrative of investigative contamination into the formal record. They produced ancient black and white photographs of the 1982 responding officers, pointing out that several deputies were not wearing modern forensic protective gear, their ungloved hands holding flashlights and clipboard documents as they navigated the apartment during the initial, chaotic search through the fog. The lead defense attorney raised his voice, his tone sharp and accusatory as he demanded to know how the state could guarantee that the billionaire's DNA had not been tracked into the apartment on the boot of a negligent officer who might have crossed paths with a young broker at a real estate mixer earlier that month. It was a desperate, hyper-technical gaslighting strategy engineered to exploit the primitive standards of 20th century policing, an expensive attempt to convince the jury that a series of minor administrative oversights could have somehow fabricated a perfect genetic match on a highly secure piece of residential architecture. But this defensive smokescreen evaporated the instant the prosecution introduced its next forensic asset, a series of internal real estate listing logs from the autumn of 1982, recovered from the suspect's own corporate archives during the pre-dawn raid on his mansion. The state prosecutors systematically demonstrated to the jury that the apartment complex where the victim resided had been managed by a subsidiary firm under the suspect's direct corporate umbrella, a company that had undergone a quiet, unpublicized security audit overseen by the billionaire himself just 3 weeks prior to the abduction. The logs revealed that the suspect had personally signed out the master keys for the building's residential wings on 3 separate occasions during the month of November, entries that had been manually altered with a different colored ink to suggest the keys had been returned hours before they actually were. The reveal was a tactical hammer blow that turned the defense's argument upside down. The total lack of forced entry wasn't a mystery, but a structural calculation executed by a man who held the physical passkeys to the victim's life, a predator who had used his professional dominance to turn a residential sanctuary into an absolute trap. Outside the courthouse doors, the coastal town was experiencing a slow, agonizing moral collapse as the details of the listing logs leaked into the community, exposing the terrifying ease with which the billionaire had integrated his predatory impulses into the daily operations of his commercial empire. Longtime residents who had bought their oceanfront homes through the suspect's firm during the real estate boom of the 1980s felt a sudden, visceral wave of nausea as they realized that the keys to their own private properties, their sanctuaries where their children slept, had been managed by the very same hand that had turned the college student's apartment into a hunting ground. The local Chamber of Commerce, which had recently commissioned a bronze statue of the suspect to commemorate his role in developing the county's commercial harbor, held an emergency midnight session to authorize the immediate removal of the monument, the heavy stone pedestal left empty on the pier like a modern ruin marking the sudden, violent execution of a manufactured reputation. The trial reached a new level of clinical horror when the state called a forensic archaeologist who specialized in the long-term preservation of microtraces in coastal marine environments, a witness whose testimony was designed to dismantle the defense's final narrative of innocent geographic proximity. Using advanced satellite telemetry and historical current charts compiled by the Naval Research Station off the coast, the expert explained to the jury that the specific combination of industrial oils and marine sediment found on the woolen glove recovered near the highway matched perfectly with the exact maintenance logs of the suspect's private sailboat from the winter of 1982. The defense lawyers objected frantically, their voices cracking with tension as they argued that marine oil was standard across every vessel in the Ventura harbor, and that the testimony was purely speculative, intended only to inflame the passions of a jury. But the judge, her expression an unbending mask of judicial neutrality, overruled the objections, allowing the scientist to project a molecular analysis that showed a rare, high-grade synthetic lubricant that had only been distributed to elite yacht owners who held private slips at the suspect's exclusive marina. The atmosphere in the room turned ice-cold as the prosecutor asked the expert to describe the specific degradation patterns of that synthetic oil when exposed to the heavy salt fog of Ventura County over a 40-year period, forcing the jury to listen to a cold, chemical description of how a piece of evidence can hold onto the signature of its owner across generations of time. The billionaire sat perfectly still during this testimony, his aristocratic chin tilted upward in a posture of fading, senile defiance, but his breathing had become shallow and rapid, his wrinkled hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that the skin over his knuckles appeared paper-white under the harsh glare of the gallery lights. The community was being forced to realize that the man they had celebrated as a visionary developer, the elite pioneer who had mapped their coastal channels, was a master of geographic evasion who had used his intimate knowledge of the Pacific currents and maritime logistics to shield his movements from the sight of the law. As the third week of the trial ground toward its conclusion, the prosecution dropped its most devastating administrative bomb, calling to the stand a former county archivist who had managed the police records vault during the late 1990s, a man who had left California abruptly in 2001 and had lived in total seclusion in rural Maine until he was located by a team of state marshals. The witness was now an elderly man, his voice trembling with a mixture of historical terror and immediate panic as he looked across the well of the courtroom at the billionaire who had once held absolute control over his livelihood and his family's safety. Under direct examination, the archivist revealed that in the winter of 1998, during a routine reorganization of the county's cold case storage bins, he had been approached by a prominent local politician, a man whose state assembly campaign had been entirely financed by the suspect's real estate trusts, who casually suggested that certain older, unresolved homicide files from 1982 were taking up valuable space and should be moved to an unindexed, off-site warehouse that lacked climate control. The archivist's testimony provided the missing structural link that connected the billionaire's financial empire directly to the active suppression of justice, proving to the jury that his evasion of the law was not a passive miracle of science, but a continuous, multi-decade campaign of political intimidation and institutional sterilization that had started before the victim's family had even stopped weeping. The witness described living for 25 years in a state of self-imposed exile, checking the security lights on his house every single night because he understood that as long as that real estate mogul held power in Ventura County, his knowledge of the missing files made him a permanent liability to an empire built on a foundation of blood. The defense team's cross-examination was an exercise in pure structural aggression, trying to paint the elderly archivist as a disgruntled, unstable former employee who was fabricating a Hollywood-style political conspiracy to settle an old municipal grudge against a civic leader. But his terror was too palpable, his memory of the specific political threats too detailed, and his description of the official council memos matched too perfectly with the cold, calculating administrative patterns the jury had already seen in the corporate logs. The weight of this accumulation of evidence began to take a visible, physical toll on the officials' legal team, who were now arriving at the courthouse each morning with the hollow eyes and exhausted postures of men who knew they were trapped in a room with a history that could not be defended by normal constitutional means. They were no longer talking to the true crime bloggers or the legal analysts on the courthouse steps. They rushed past the cameras with their heads down, their briefcases clutched to their chests like shields, their confident public declarations of innocence replaced by a total, sullen silence that perfectly mirrored the catatonic behavior of their client. The community outside had reached a state of emotional saturation, a collective realization that the trial was not just a judgment of a single elderly man, but an autopsy of an entire era of California history, an era where wealth, property development, and elite social standing were allowed to buy an absolute exemption from the moral laws of the universe. The closing arguments of the state were scheduled for a Monday morning that brought a sudden, violent Pacific storm to the coastline, with heavy sheets of gray rain lashing against the tall arched windows of the Ventura courtroom, creating a natural, dimmed soundtrack that matched the dark gravity of the moment. The lead state prosecutor stood before the jury not as a politician seeking a victory, but as a clinical narrator of a 44-year injustice, using a massive digital timeline that filled the entire wall behind the defense table to show how every single day of the official's public career had been a calculated insult to the memory of the woman he had destroyed. He walked the jury through the genetic genealogy matches one last time, then connected them to the listing logs, the maritime records, the synthetic oil prints, and the hidden basement clippings, weaving these separate pieces of historical debris into an unassailable mountain of ironclad scientific certainty. He pointed his finger directly at the white-haired billionaire, his voice steady and echoing through the vaulted space as he demanded that the jury finally strip the predator of his titles, his wealth, and his freedom, returning the town to a reality where the law applied equally to everyone, regardless of the zip code they inhabited or the corporate empires they commanded. When the defense stood for their final address, the argument felt entirely hollow, a repetitive recitation of constitutional technicalities about digital privacy and data collection algorithms that sounded completely insignificant against the reality of a life violently interrupted and a community systematically deceived for a generation. They tried one last time to invoke the image of the dedicated philanthropist, pointing to the university wings, the children's hospitals, and the public parks that the suspect's estate had financed across Southern California, but the words fell flat in a room that was still echoing with the description of master keys and altered listing logs. The billionaire himself watched his lawyers with a blank, detached expression, his eyes fixed on the clock on the back wall as if he were counting down the final minutes of the grand illusion he had maintained since November of 1982. When the jury finally retired to the deliberation room, the silence that returned to the court was absolute, a heavy, expectant void that hung over the entire coastline as the town waited to see if the scales of justice could finally balance a debt that had been compounding in the dark for over 40 years. The jury deliberation for this 44-year-old California cold case did not proceed like a standard evaluation of circumstantial facts. It quickly transformed into a high-stakes psychological siege that held the entire coastal valley in a state of absolute, volatile paralysis. Inside the locked deliberation room, 12 ordinary citizens were left entirely alone with the physical and digital wreckage of a predator's double life. The virtual three-dimensional maps of the apartment, the altered real estate logs, the maritime records of the silent yacht, and that single, unassailable strand of hair preserved like a lethal biological weapon inside its glass case. Outside, on the rain-slicked streets of Ventura, the normal momentum of daily life ground to a sudden halt as storefront televisions remained tuned continuously to the live feeds from the courthouse plaza, and discussions at coastal coffee shops were reduced to brief, anxious whispers about the delay. Every hour that passed without a knock on the courtroom door was interpreted by the community as a sign of deep, structural friction within the panel, a terrifying possibility that the billionaire's immense wealth and deep-rooted social capital had somehow managed to plant a seed of corruption or doubt in the mind of a single juror. The local police department, acutely aware of the raw emotional currents running through the beachside neighborhoods, placed extra tactical units on high alert, transforming the perimeter of the historic complex into a heavily barricaded zone of absolute vigilance. The agonizing wait ended not with a dramatic outburst of sound, but with a sharp, rhythmic three-knock signal from the bailiff that sent an immediate, visceral shockwave through the entire legal and political apparatus of the state. Within 15 minutes, The vaulted courtroom was packed to its absolute physical capacity, with spectators squeezed tightly into the wooden benches and standing 3 deep along the plaster walls, their unblinking eyes fixed on the empty leather chair where the county's most prominent developer had sat for the last month. When the security team escorted the white-haired billionaire into the room, he was no longer projecting the arrogant, aristocratic confidence that had characterized his decades at the summit of the Southern California elite. His tailored suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame, his face was the color of weathered coastal stone, and his eyes remained fixed firmly on the carpet, refusing to look at the gallery where his former business partners sat shoulder to shoulder with the aging classmates of the woman he had stolen from the world in 1982. The jurors marched in with a heavy, solemn cadence, their expressions entirely unreadable, their gazes deliberately avoiding both the prosecution and defense tables as they took their places in the box for the final time. The silence that occupied the space was so absolute, so suffocating, that the rustling of the court clerk's paperwork sounded like a physical tear through the hot, stagnant air of the room. When the judge asked the foreperson if they had reached a unanimous verdict, the man stood up, his voice trembling slightly under the immense historical gravity of the moment, but carrying a clear, devastating resonance that cut through the room like a razor blade. As the word guilty left his lips, repeated with mechanical precision for every separate count of capital murder, kidnapping, burglary, and the active obstruction of a public investigation, a collective gasp ripped through the gallery, a sound that was half sob, half release, the sudden, violent exhaling of a community that had been holding its breath for over 40 years. The victim's former roommate collapsed forward against the wooden railing, her shoulders shaking with the release of a lifelong psychological sentence, while across the aisle, the billionaire's remaining corporate executives sat in stunned, rigid silence, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated ruin as they realized their vast economic empire had just been permanently severed from its source of power. The official himself did not flinch, did not cry, and did not speak. He merely closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his posture freezing into the cold, static vacancy of a man who had finally realized that his own genetic code had traveled through time to act as his executioner. The sentencing phase was swift, clinical, and completely devoid of the mercy the real estate mogul had so often championed during his public charity galas and university board meetings, with the judge delivering a verbal lashing that effectively erased the defendant's name from the respectable history of the state. The magistrate, a veteran California jurist who had seen the worst of the region's white-collar and violent offenders, looked down from her bench with an expression of ironclad disgust, noting that the defendant's crimes were magnified 1,000 times by the position of absolute luxury and social trust he had used as a shield to protect his malice. She sentenced the 84-year-old billionaire to life in prison without the slightest possibility of parole, adding consecutive decades for the political obstruction and records tampering charges to ensure that even if a future corporate alliance attempted to secure a legal loophole or medical release, the net would remain tightly knotted around his neck until his final breath. As the judge's heavy gavel came down for the final time, the sound carried the definitive weight of an iron vault door slamming shut on an entire era of the county's history, a declaration that the unassailable power of modern forensic science had finally broken through the fortress of elite privilege to claim its long overdue debt. The transition from the secure elevator to the state transport van was an exercise in extreme high-security logistics designed to shield the fallen titan from the raw, unpredictable fury of the massive crowd that had gathered on the courthouse steps under the darkening coastal sky. Hundreds of residents, carrying vintage photographs of the victim and signs reading, "Justice delayed is not justice denied," line the concrete barricades, their quiet grief having transformed into a loud, demanding roar for institutional transparency as the heavy metal garage doors of the building ground upward. When the armored transport vehicle emerged, surrounded by state trooper motorcycles with their sirens wailing into the damp coastal breeze, the crowd surged forward against the iron railings, a sea of flashing smartphone cameras and shouting voices that forced the billionaire to look through the reinforced glass at the exact reality of his total public ruin. He was being driven out of the county he had structurally built and ruled for 40 years, not as a leader, not as a philanthropist, but as a caged beast, stripped of his titles, his honors, his wealth, and his dignity, heading toward a monochromatic world of gray concrete and steel bars where his elite status would carry no more weight than the scratching of a rat inside the drywall. The immediate aftermath of the conviction left the real estate firm's headquarters in a state of absolute structural chaos as a team of state receivers and federal forensic auditors moved into the glass tower to begin the agonizing process of purging the billionaire's legacy from the regional market. Every commercial contract he had signed, every beachfront zoning variance he had championed, and every land development he had overseen during his 40-year tenure was placed under a magnifying glass, turning the entire local construction industry into a secondary crime scene of financial and administrative corruption. Investigators discovered that the official had systematically used his financial contributions to the county's municipal funds to subtly influence the scheduling of cold case reviews, purposefully ensuring that the 1982 files remained buried under a mountain of administrative backlogs and underfunded technological resources. The realization that their local property investments had been actively manipulated by a killer to fund his own multi-decade invisibility was a profound, nauseating revelation for the residents, forcing them to understand that the luxury coastal views they enjoyed were the literal byproducts of a deal made with a monster. At the County Forensics Archive, a quiet but deeply symbolic ritual took place just days after the sentencing, as the chief archivist pulled the physical 1982 file from the active investigation vault and brought it down to the permanent historical repository for the last time. She stamped the faded cardboard folder with a heavy, red ink mark that read, "Resolved via advanced genetic genealogy. Full conviction secured." A simple, bureaucratic action that marked the end of the most devastating cold case in the history of the California surf. But as she placed the box onto the metal shelf alongside the closed files of ordinary property disputes and historic corporate litigations, the room felt heavy with the knowledge that a red stamp could not truly undo the damage the predator had inflicted on the soul of the community. The file was now a historical artifact, a piece of dark folklore that would be studied by future generations of law enforcement as a masterclass in the banality of elite evil, a chilling proof that the most dangerous predators do not live in the abandoned alleys on the edge of town, but in the oceanfront mansions where the local economy is directed. The executive board of the local university, where the billionaire had stood before the podium for decades as a trustee and a primary donor, underwent its own painful, internal purge, with the State Educational Council arriving to formally strip the defendant of his honorary degrees and dissolve the development committees he had directed for so long. The faculty and student body sat in the auditorium in a state of collective, historical shock, listening to the university president read a statement of profound apology to the victim's surviving family, their eyes tracking the empty space where the billionaire's name had recently been sandblasted off the facade of the science building. The elegant glass pavilion, which had been funded by a major corporate donation from the official's estate in the late 90s, suddenly looked like a monument to absolute hypocrisy, a reminder of how easily a human being can use the language of education and civic philanthropy to mask a heart of absolute, unyielding malice. The campus became a focal point for the town's broader, existential crisis, a realization that if their academic leaders, their business partners, and their neighbors could be so easily deceived by a calculated performance, then the very concept of community trust was a fragile, dangerous illusion. While the town struggled to find its footing in this new, ruined landscape, the victims' surviving relatives retreated entirely from the public eye, turning away the book publishers, the television network producers, and the true crime podcasters who descended upon their home like vultures looking to monetize their 44 years of agony. They chose instead to hold a private, quiet memorial service at the edge of the coastal cliffs near her former apartment, a space that was entirely free from the noise of flashing cameras, legal jargon, and political commentary. The victim's former roommate, now standing as a resilient witness to the ultimate triumph of science over time, laid a bouquet of fresh coastal wildflowers on the grass, looking out over the Pacific horizon that had been haunted by the shadow of the unknown for her entire adult life. For her, the high-tech verdict was not a celebration. It was a quiet, heavy liberation. The moment the phantom finally stopped clawing at her window, the moment she could look at the incoming coastal fog without feeling the sudden, freezing spike of childhood terror. The luxury yacht, where the state police continued to analyze the structural materials using advanced chemical imaging sprays, was eventually sold at a federal asset auction and scheduled for complete structural destruction, an event that many residents felt was necessary to rid the harbor of its most potent symbol of hidden horror. Heavy industrial salvage crews arrived on a gray, misty morning at the San Pedro shipyard, their cranes and hydraulic saws making short work of the grand teak decks, the polished brass fixtures, and the hidden bulkhead compartments that had held the billionaire's private secrets for 4 decades, reducing the symbol of his coastal dominance to a mountain of splintered fiberglass and shattered glass. The hull itself was crushed into raw industrial waste and buried beneath tons of scrap metal, a final, structural ceiling of a vessel that had mocked the sea for 44 years. The slip where it had been docked was left empty, an anonymous patch of water that would eventually be forgotten by the passing tourists on the pier, a quiet erasure that matched the final, permanent exit of the man who had owned it. As the weeks turned into months, the international news vans finally packed up their satellite dishes and left Ventura County, moving on to chase newer, fresher horrors in other zip codes, leaving the town to confront the long, slow, and agonizing process of living with its own altered history. The 1982 cold case was gone from the headlines, but its residual poison remained embedded in the character of the community, turning every casual conversation into a guarded exchange and every friendly smile into an object of quiet, subconscious scrutiny. The town had survived the monster, it had broken through his financial fortress, and it had watched him be led away in chains, but it had paid for that victory with its innocence, leaving behind a coastal landscape that was slightly darker, slightly colder, and permanently aware of the wolves that walk among the sheep. The story of the California billionaire was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a permanent, haunting truth carved into the bedrock of the valley, a reminder that justice is a patient, terrifying hunter that will always, inevitably, pull the monster out of the light of public honor and into the absolute darkness of his own making. The departure of the global true crime networks and investigative journalists did not trigger a return to the breezy, carefree coastal complacency that had characterized Ventura County before the genetic genealogy breakthrough. Instead, it marked the beginning of a cold, psychological winter where the community was forced to live entirely alone with the structural ruins of its own history. The legendary California Sunshine, which had for generations served as a multi-billion-dollar marketing tool to draw affluent residents to the cliffs of Ventura, seemed to lose its warmth, casting long, defensive shadows across the beachside avenues where a serial predator had once navigated with the unshakable confidence of a prominent local mogul. Inside the county real estate board and the municipal development offices, the silence was dense, almost suffocating, as the remaining administrators moved through the corridors like ghosts, avoiding eye contact and speaking only in the flat, clinical shorthand of individuals who knew their entire professional past was being treated as a secondary crime scene by federal receivers. The empty penthouse office where the billionaire had directed the physical expansion of the coastline remained sealed behind heavy plastic sheeting and biometric evidence tape, an artificial tomb in the center of the local economy that served as a daily reminder of how easily a monster can hide behind a skyscraper. This profound systemic betrayal manifested as a generational paralysis, deeply infecting the town's younger residents who had grown up watching the billionaire receive civic honors, fund university departments, and deliver inspirational speeches about integrity at youth leadership summits. The sudden, high-tech realization that their community's premier philanthropist was a calculated predator who had used his corporate dominance to hide a history of absolute malice tore down the traditional, innocent respect for authority that keeps a suburban enclave together, replacing it with a hard, cynical detachment. High school students and young surfers looked at the local police department with an open, defensive suspicion, wondering how many of the historical deputies had consciously overlooked suspicious prowler reports or altered local trespass logs to protect the real estate firm's commercial listings and preservation grants. The local library's archive of historical newspapers from the winter of 1982, which featured full-page profiles celebrating the suspects' early corporate partnerships, became an object of quiet horror, its microfilms handled with the same clinical revulsion one might reserve for a biohazard exhibit, a physical proof of how deeply the predator's legacy had been woven into the milestones of their childhoods. The state's specialized task force, operating out of a secure, anonymous facility miles from the county lines to ensure absolute insulation from the regional political network, continued its relentless post-conviction audit, pulling thousands of historical land deeds, maritime permits, and commercial construction blueprints from the vault. They discovered a highly disturbing pattern of geographic manipulation from the mid-'80s, where the billionaire had systematically used dummy corporations and offshore accounts to acquire isolated parcels of coastal canyon land immediately following spikes in regional assault reports. The digital maps compiled by the investigators revealed that every single one of these land acquisitions had occurred within a 6-week window of a major cold case inquiry development, demonstrating that whenever the police department of the era had gotten close to checking the coastal perimeters, the mogul had simply purchased the dirt, installed heavy steel access gates, and designated the territory as a private development zone. This wasn't just a criminal evading a standard highway patrol. It was a billionaire rewriting the legal cartography of Southern California to ensure that his private hunting grounds would remain permanently off-limits to civilian eyes and modern environmental scouts. As the financial auditors dug deeper into the corporate ledgers, a darker pattern of administrative sterilization emerged from the lines of data, a deliberate, multi-decade campaign to ensure that the local police force remained technically incapable of analyzing the biological residue of his youth. The billionaire had consistently used his position on regional civic committees to lobby against upgrading the county's long-term evidence storage facilities, purposefully directing public funds toward visible infrastructure projects like highway beautification, while allowing the precinct's basement lockers to suffer from structural neglect. He had argued on the public record that the county should prioritize traditional, face-to-face investigative policing over investing taxpayer dollars in the speculative, high-cost luxury of early DNA profiling technology, a political stance that had been widely praised by local tax watchdog groups at the time as a masterclass in fiscal discipline. The reality was a terrifying masterclass in criminal foresight. The predator was using his immense social influence to systematically blind the state's future forensic capabilities, ensuring that if science ever evolved to the point of reading the hair snagged on that porch railing, the infrastructure to process it would be so disorganized that the evidence would rot in the dark before it could ever reach a laboratory sequencer. While the state troopers tore through the corporate paper trails, the psychological isolation of the billionaire's surviving family members turned into a permanent, domestic siege inside their heavily fortified mansion on the edge of the cliffs. His wife, who had spent 40 years as the undisputed social queen of the coastal elite, organizing high society fundraisers and hosting private dinners for state senators, had completely vanished from the public eye, her daily necessities delivered by private security couriers and her perimeter fences reinforced with modern infrared cameras to keep looky-loose away. The community's old sympathy for her, the initial assumption that she was an innocent victim of a horrific double life, had curdled into a cold, judgmental distance as leaks from the grand jury indicated that her hours of closed-door testimony had revealed a history of matching inconsistencies she had actively chosen to ignore to preserve her status. The town could not forgive the fact that she had lived a life of extraordinary luxury funded by the corporate operations of a killer, that she had shared a bed just miles from the apartment where the student had been taken, and that she had chosen to view her husband's late-night absences through the protective, comfortable lens of corporate business rather than the demanding eyes of basic human decency. The local tourism and real estate economy, heavily dependent on the coastal developments and premium lifestyle partnerships the billionaire had brokered through his private investment funds, began to experience a slow, structural collapse as international brands scrambled to dissolve their relationships with the valley. Major luxury hotel projects that had been scheduled to break ground along the cliffs were suddenly canceled or relocated to other counties, leaving empty, cleared fields of topsoil along the Pacific Highway that looked like physical scars on the landscape, matching the internal desolation of the town itself. The regional bank, where the billionaire had served as a primary shareholder since 1985, was placed under immediate federal oversight after auditors uncovered an intricate network of low-interest personal loans extended to historical county supervisors, loans that carried no repayment schedules but aligned perfectly with votes on coastal zoning boards that favored the officials' development projects. The residents were learning through the brutal reality of frozen equity accounts and tanking property values that their clean water lines, their paved beachfront boardwalks, and their economic stability were the literal byproducts of a deal made with a monster, a collective bribe paid to an entire population to keep them from asking what happened in the fog of 1982. Deep within the monochrome, hyper-secure environment of the Pelican Bay State Prison System, the billionaire had already been stripped of his identity, his premium tailored suits replaced by a coarse, orange jumpsuit stamped with an institutional serial number that carried no currency in the world of the yard. He was placed in a specialized administrative segregation cell block, a structural designation meant to protect him from the general population inmates who viewed a high-profile real estate tycoon as an absolute trophy, a target whose destruction would guarantee their own legendary status within the prison hierarchy. He spent 23 hours a day in a concrete room that was the exact dimensions of a standard shipping container, his view of the outside world reduced to a thin vertical slit of reinforced glass that showed nothing but the gray gravel perimeter wall and the rhythmic movement of armed tower guards. He rarely spoke to the institutional psychiatrists, refusing to participate in the mandatory behavioral evaluations, his demeanor settling into a cold, calculated catatonia that was his final attempt to deny the state access to his inner mechanics, a silent declaration that though they had caged his body, his memories remained his private sovereign domain. Back in the town, the forensic geneticists who had cracked the cold case were invited by the Regional Law Enforcement Academy to deliver a closed-door lecture on the methodology of the high-tech breakthrough, a presentation that was treated by the older detectives as a formal funeral for the traditional world of criminal investigation. The scientists stood before the row of silent, uniformed officers and demonstrated how the genetic genealogy algorithm had bypassed every single corrupted land record, every dropped lead, and every piece of multi-million-dollar political intimidation by simply tracing the immutable biological markers left behind on that rough wood porch railing. They explained that in the modern era of automated DNA sequencing, a predator no longer had the luxury of outsmarting the local sheriff or buying the silence of a county board. Their own family tree had become an automated, global surveillance network that would eventually track them down through the saliva samples of distant relatives they had never met. The lecture was a clinical demonstration of absolute inevitability, a proof that the passage of time, once a criminal's greatest ally, had been converted by science into a relentless, compounding trap that would eventually pull every historical horror out of the dark and into the blinding glare of a modern courtroom. The physical site of the original disappearance, the quiet, modest apartment complex where the young woman had spent her final evening, had become a dark landmark for true crime tourists who drove through Ventura on weekends, their slow-moving vehicles and flashing cameras infuriating the new tenants who had moved into the neighborhood without knowing its history. The building had been entirely repainted. The old entryway doorframe where the touch DNA had been recovered was replaced by modern vinyl construction, and the surrounding walkways were filled with vibrant landscaping, but the structural memory of that November night in 1982 could not be renovated out of the neighborhood's consciousness. Neighbors who had lived on the block for 40 years still found themselves looking at the front steps whenever the coastal fog began to roll in from the Pacific, their minds instantly replaying the image of the flashing emergency lights from their youth and the cold, terrifying realization that the wealthy young broker who had stood with them on the sidewalk offering condolences was the one who had carried the girl into the dark. The street had become a psychological monument to their own collective blindness, a permanent reminder of how easily they had allowed themselves to be comforted by the polite words of an elite official while the true nature of the crime was staring them directly in the face. As the winter rains began to fall over California, turning the coastal canyons into a rushing torrent of mud and gray water. The Ventura County Board of Supervisors held its first public session since the sentencing, an event that was meant to signal a new beginning but felt more like a memorial service for a ruined institution. The chairs where the billionaire and his political allies had sat for decades were occupied by a temporary panel of state-appointed administrators, their flat, neutral voices reading listless technical reports about municipal restructuring and debt management to an empty gallery. The citizens of the town didn't show up to voice their opinions or demand changes. They stayed home, their absence a silent, crushing declaration of total exhaustion, a collective recognition that the political system was so deeply compromised that participation felt like a grotesque validation of a lie. The town had lost its civic voice, its pride replaced by a defensive, protective survivalism that forced every family to retreat into their own private spaces, locking their doors early and turning off their porch lights, determined to live their lives entirely outside the shadow of a government that had betrayed them for 44 years. The legacy of the California 1982 cold case was ultimately not a story of a system working to correct its own errors, but a chilling, multi-layered autopsy of how easily a wealthy community can be hollowed out from the inside by a predator who understands the social currency of public honor and financial charity. The 1982 folder was closed. The red stamp in the municipal basement was dry. The yacht was a pile of scrap metal in San Pedro, and the penthouse office was an empty shell of plastic sheeting, but the internal character of the town had been permanently altered by the realization that their peace was a manufactured illusion, a product of a continuous, decades-long cover-up that had infected their universities, their charities, their banks, and their homes. The community had used the unassailable power of modern forensic science to tear away the official's mask and watched him be led away to a concrete cell where he would eventually turn into dust. But they had paid for that truth with the very fabric of their security, leaving behind a coastal landscape that would move into the future with a permanent, defensive limp. A collective awareness that the wolves who hunt the innocent do not wait on the edges of the dark, but walk down the center aisle of the front row, wearing the tailored suits of public office, smiling at your families, and directing the very laws that are meant to keep the dark from breaking through. The breaking of the early spring tide along the jagged cliffs of Ventura County did not wash away the gray, psychological residue that had settled over the coastal heartland since the billionaire's high-tech unmasking. As the relentless Pacific waves crashed against the rocky bluffs below the suspect's former mansion, they seemed to mimic the grinding, unyielding pace of the state's ongoing post-conviction excavation. The multi-acre oceanfront estate, which had once been the crown jewel of local luxury real estate, sat in a state of grotesque, heavily policed suspension, a raw landscape of deep perimeter trenches, core sampling drills, and brilliant yellow police line tape that whipped frantically against the wind-warped cypress trees whenever the ocean gale swept through the canyons. This wasn't just an abandoned property. It was a physical manifestation of a 44-year-old cold case that refused to be neatly tucked away into a courthouse ledger, a terrain stripped of its manicured perfection to reveal the dark, subterranean secrets that had been nurtured beneath its foundations since the winter of 1982. Inside the central precinct of the Ventura County Sheriff's Department, the atmosphere had entered a phase of permanent, structural exhaustion that no modern public relations campaign or management shakeup could truly mask. The temporary state regulators who had overseen the department following the pre-dawn raid had finally dissolved their presence, leaving behind a newly installed administration of outside law enforcement professionals who walked through the hallways with a cold, clinical detachment that deeply alienated the remaining old guard deputies. These new leaders possessed no multi-generational ties to the local families, no interest in the historical social hierarchies of the coastal elite, and absolute zero tolerance for the protective, insular culture of a bullpen that had allowed a serial predator to influence its forensic priorities for decades. They installed state-of-the-art biometric logging systems at every entry point, integrated automated chain-of-custody tracking across all evidence lockers, and replaced the weathered oak desks with sterile, gray modular workstations that felt entirely stripped of human history. The department was being aggressively sanitized, dragged into the modern era by an influx of state capital and clinical bureaucracy, but beneath the slick, efficient surface of the new regime, the older deputies could still feel the crushing, static pressure of the historical failure that had forever compromised their batch. This pervasive sense of institutional degradation was mirrored in the executive boardrooms of the regional banks and investment trusts that line the coastal valleys, which were now undergoing a devastating secondary wave of public exposure as bankruptcy courts began the painful process of liquidating the officials' multi-million-dollar corporate network. The elegant, glass-fronted financial towers on Main Street, where the billionaire's real estate firm had held dominant sway for over 40 years, saw their corporate insignias aggressively scrubbed from the building facades over a single weekend, replaced by the generic, pixelated logos of national conglomerates that had purchased the distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. Local developers and independent contractors who had relied on the suspects' private financing to bankroll their residential expansions found themselves suddenly caught in a tightening vice of high-interest corporate debt, their personal financial stability completely shattered by their proximity to the fallen mogul's money machine. The community was learning, through the brutal mechanics of federal foreclosure notices and public asset auctions on the courthouse steps, that their decades of unparalleled coastal prosperity had been directly subsidized by the silence of a monster, that the luxury boom of the late 20th century was merely a glittering, structural bribe paid to ensure the public would never look too closely at the darkness festering in the executive suites. As the corporate liquidators tore through the physical and digital records of the official's estate, they were forced to confront the absolute, terrifying scale of his private domestic surveillance apparatus, a system of control that extended far beyond his professional real estate power into the private homes of his inner circle. In a hidden sub-basement of his oceanfront residence, behind a reinforced steel vault door that required an encrypted digital key to bypass, state forensic technicians discovered a massive wall of high-definition servers and magnetic recording arrays that were wired directly into the telecommunication backbones of the county administration building, the regional zoning offices, and the private lines of several high-ranking municipal supervisors. The audio logs, which dated back to the early winter of 1985, revealed that the predator had been systematically blackmailing his own business partners, his political allies, and his administrative staff, utilizing illegally intercepted conversations about financial irregularities, extramarital affairs, and small-town corporate scandals to ensure that no one within the local government would ever have the leverage or the courage to question his late-night movements or his unusual influence over the police archives. The town was forced to look at a reality that was far more complex and insidious than a single act of spontaneous violence in 1982. They were looking at a carefully engineered, localized autocracy where the survival of an entire socioeconomic class had been dependent on their willingness to protect the secrets of an apex predator who held the keys to their public and private ruin. The public exposure of this blackmail matrix effectively destroyed the remaining social cohesion of Ventura's luxury developments, turning old friends into bitter, paranoid adversaries who spent their evenings reviewing 40 years of political favors, neighborhood gossip, and country club partnerships to calculate who had known about the tapes and who had actively participated in the suppression of the truth to safeguard their own reputations. The exclusive yacht clubs and golf resorts, which had once been the premier venues for the region's elite to host high society fundraisers and political galas under the officials' direct corporate sponsorship, saw their private memberships plummet within weeks as residents refused to sit in the same dining rooms with individuals whose names had been discovered on the black box recordings. The neighborhood culture of affluent beachside gatherings was entirely replaced by a defensive, locked-door isolationism where families remained behind their high-security gates, their televisions tuned continuously to the live state legal feeds, their minds consumed by the terrifying knowledge that the polite, wealthy grandfather who had helped finance their local schools and charitable clinics had been using that very same philanthropy to purchase their absolute, unconscious complicity in his crimes. While the community turned inward, eating itself alive with suspicion and historical guilt, the state prosecution team began the complex, high-stakes preparation for a massive federal civil rights trial that would target the county government itself. An institutional lawsuit designed to establish absolute legal accountability for the decades of administrative obstruction that had kept the 1982 cold case from being resolved in the pre-digital era. The state attorneys flooded the local media with official subpoena notices for current and former city council members, forcing ordinary civil servants to hire expensive defense lawyers from Los Angeles and Sacramento to protect themselves from being dragged into a federal conspiracy indictment that could result in significant prison sentences and the total forfeiture of their public pensions. The courtroom in the state capitol became a theater for the clinical autopsy of small-town political corruption, with prosecutors demonstrating through a mountain of internal memos, unrecorded budget allocations, and sudden changes in police leadership that the county administration had operated as a protective cocoon for the billionaire, prioritizing the preservation of their institutional image over the constitutional rights of the young college student who had been erased from the world. Deep within the monochrome, high-security environment of the Pelican Bay State Penitentiary, the official had adjusted to the permanent, mechanical rhythm of his condemnation with the cold, calculated stoicism of a man who still believed that his total silence was a form of personal victory over the system that had stripped him of his name. He refused to grant interviews to the true crime authors and investigative biographers who wrote him daily letters offering millions of dollars for a definitive, narrated confession. His incoming mail was strictly restricted to a single legal pad from his appellate team, and his daily human contact was limited to the flat, monosyllabic commands of the correctional officers who monitored his movements through the reinforced steel mesh of his cell block. He spent his single hour of mandatory daily recreation walking in small, tight circles around the asphalt yard of the administrative segregation unit, his eyes fixed firmly on the concrete wall above him, his posture maintaining a ghostly, rigid mimicry of the corporate authority he had once wielded over the county. He understood, with the terrifying clarity of a pure sociopath, that as long as he refused to give the state the location of the physical remnants or explain the exact mechanics of his 1982 movements, he maintained an absolute, untouchable domain over the final chapter of the tragedy, a silent declaration that though the state had claimed his freedom, his malice remained a private, sovereign state that no forensic algorithm or genetic sequence could ever truly conquer. Back in the changing topography of the valley, the forensic geneticists who had ignited the initial breakthrough announced the creation of a permanent regional archive dedicated exclusively to the cold cases of the Pacific coastline, an initiative that was funded by a massive grant from the Victims Foundation and designed to ensure that no wealthy developer or small-town politician could ever again use their local influence to freeze a criminal investigation. The laboratory, located in a neutral, modern industrial park miles from the county lines, became a focal point for families from across 3 states who had spent decades living in the same agonizing vacuum of uncertainty that had once defined the young student's roommate, their arms filled with old police files, faded missing person posters, and cardboard boxes of clothing that had been preserved in attics and basements since the 70s and 80s. The scientists moved through these historical relics with a calm, military precision, extracting the microscopic biological ghosts of long-dead predators from the weathered fibers of the past, converting the raw, chaotic tragedies of the coastline into clean, unassailable digital sequences that were immediately uploaded into the global tracking network. The lab had effectively converted the 1982 breakthrough into a continuous, automated engine of historical accountability, a technological hammer that hung over every aging criminal who had relied on the ignorance of the pre-digital era to protect their comfortable, modern retirements. The actual site of the official's former suburban real estate headquarters, which had sat abandoned and guarded by state troopers since the day of the sentencing, was eventually purchased by a regional land trust at a public tax auction and slated for complete ecological restoration, a process that many residents viewed as a necessary, structural exorcism of the physical environment that had nurtured his double life. A crew of heavy demolition contractors arrived on a crisp April morning, their massive excavators and hydraulic rams making short work of the grand pillars, the vaulted ceilings, and the reinforced basement walls that had once held the politician's illegal surveillance matrix, reducing the symbol of his local dominance to a mountain of shattered brick, concrete dust, and broken glass that was immediately hauled away in a convoy of industrial dump trucks. The swimming pool was filled with crushed stone, The perfectly manicured hedges that had blocked the view of the paparazzi were ripped out by their roots, and the entire multi-acre lot was graded down to the raw topsoil, planted with native California prairie grasses and wildflowers that would eventually grow to look like the natural, untamed landscape that had existed before the first luxury developments were carved out of the coastal cliffs. It was a complete, structural erasure of his presence from the neighborhood, a physical declaration by the community that some histories are too toxic to be preserved in the architecture of their daily lives, leaving behind an anonymous, open field that would offer no comfort and no memory to the passing generation. As the late spring rain began to fall over the region, turning the newly planted prairie into a vibrant, deep green carpet that shimmered under the gray Midwestern sky, the town's remaining civic leaders gathered in the renovated council chambers for the formal presentation of the new county charter, a document that was designed by state legal experts to permanently dismantle the concentration of executive power that the official had exploited for 30 years. The atmosphere in the room was flat, formal, and heavy with a lingering, protective caution. The public gallery was partially filled with younger residents who watched the proceedings with a hard, unblinking vigilance, their presence a silent reminder to the politicians that the old era of blind trust and backroom deals was permanently dead. There were no grand speeches about the virtues of heartland community life, no ribbon-cutting showmanship, and no celebratory applause when the new charter was signed into law. The politicians simply moved through the line-item adjustments with the quiet, listless precision of clerks completing a necessary administrative chore, their voices carrying the flat, humble tone of people who knew their titles had been forever compromised by the actions of the man who had preceded them. The true legacy of the California cold case was ultimately not a story of a system working to correct its own errors, but a chilling, multi-layered autopsy of how easily a wealthy community can be hollowed out from the inside by a predator who understands the social